morning. Good morning. Welcome everyone to this morning's webinar. We are catching up today to discuss making defensible medically informed decisions at scale. So today our presenters are both from KINNECT and Carelever. We're presenting this webinar in unison. So we've got Dr. Matthew Brandt. Matt is KINNECT's Chief Medical Officer and an environmental and occupational physician. Welcome, Matt, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And then my name's Zach. I am the Head of Growth and Customer Success at Carelever and a physiotherapist by background. We've got a full agenda today. We've got a really great number of people who've signed up. It's actually the biggest webinar that we've ever run. So we know that this is a really hot topic for a lot of organisations. This is going to be recorded and we'll be able to provide that recording out to everyone who has registered for the webinar as well. With the agenda today, we're going to be running through the risks of inconsistent medically informed decisions, the need for reliable, valid role and site and risk-based task information, using structured clinical frameworks for consistency, how and when to use predictive decision support, and the importance of centralising decisions and evidence. Now, I would say we're really keen on getting your questions throughout the presentation and the webinar. We will be keeping them to the end though, so if you pop your questions in, we'll read them out to Matt at the end. Just with the guidance that we can't actually make, and Matt can't make comments on any specific cases or anything like that, and that Matt is an occupational physician, a doctor, a very good one, but he's also not a lawyer. So anything legal, we will have to defer. But with that being said, we might get underway and dive straight into the problem. So, Matt, let's start right at the beginning with the problem. In your clinical experience, how common is it for employers to genuinely not know whether their medically informed decisions would hold up under scrutiny?
I think it's probably very common, and it's not usually because people don't care. Most organisations, obviously, that we deal with have a medical process, so they do pre-employment medicals or periodic medicals with a range of components, such as functional testing. So there's no lack of effort. I think where the gap tends to sit is that some employers haven't had to actively test whether their overall fitness for work governance system produces outcomes that are consistent, that are role anchored and explainable across all sites and providers. That only really becomes visible when the system is stress tested. So, for example, during an incident investigation or a dispute or an audit. So it's not because someone did the wrong thing, but because there were weaknesses in role information or decision frameworks or documentation or handoffs. And I just wanted to also separate some responsibilities here, Zach. Doctors provide a fitness opinion.
Sure.
Based on health information and on the inherent requirements of the role or genuine occupational requirements, depending on the jurisdiction. Employers then make deployment and adjustment decisions informed by that opinion. Risk arises when the handoff isn't structured or consistent. So when the link between health findings, inherent role requirements, and downstream decisions isn't clear or well documented. So the real question isn't, did the employer do a medical? It is, could the employer explain why this worker was cleared for this role at this point in time? And once you scale that across multiple sites, as we frequently have in the Australian jurisdictions, across multiple clinicians with different health providers and large volumes of work, little variations in inputs or interpretation can quickly turn into significant governance challenges.
Thank you, Matt. That's quite the problem. So you spoke then a lot about, the value of consistency, and conversely, there's a risk of inconsistency that we need to consider there. So when a medically informed decision gets challenged, so whether that's in a dispute or a regulator audit or a post-incident review, what does defensible decision-making actually look like?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Obviously, professing that I'm not a lawyer, but I'm coming from a clinical governance lens. So the medical service or medical component provides a fitness work opinion and recommendations based on the health evidence and inherent role requirements. The employer then makes deployment and adjustment decisions, as previously mentioned. When the fitness to work opinion and the employer's actions taken in response to it come under scrutiny, my sense is that a defensible outcome will have a few consistent features. Firstly, the outcome is clearly anchored to the inherent role requirements, not the job title, not a generic position description, but what the job actually involves, including safety critical tasks, work environment, supervision level, consequences of sudden incapacity or inattention. And it's more than that, obviously. It's whether someone is able to consistently attend the workplace, whether that's a remote workplace, a home or whatever,
Sure.
and effectively do the job, so be productive. So if the role requirements aren't clear, the clinical opinion can't be properly targeted and the employer can't show that their actions were proportionate if they're challenged downstream. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the outcome relies upon contemporaneous relevant health information, and it's clear what information was relied upon in the decision-making process. So I think defensibility is improved if you can say, this is what we knew at the time, this is what was relevant to the job demands and risks, and this is why we recommended what we did. So I think this is especially important if you've got different health providers involved in the assessment process, or if someone later asked by one person, well, why was this person fit with restrictions, but that person was fit? Thirdly, I think there has to be good documentation. There has to be clear documentation of the reasoning in a way that links the health findings to the inherent role requirements, resulting in the recommended controls or restrictions guiding the employer action. This is the missing middle in some systems. You don't need to have legalistic language. You just need a clear chain of logic. And if the organisation later has to explain itself, that documented chain is what's going to prevent the whole discussion from collapsing into hindsight or opinion. And there's a fourth issue that I've identified. The process is consistent and governed with escalation rules for higher consequence scenarios. So in other words, the organisation has clear risk-based escalation rules. Routine, low consequences scenarios are handled routinely, but higher consequence roles or more complex health issues trigger an additional medical review or oversight. So for example, your organisation may have decided that a higher consequence role, like a machinery operator, is assessed using a higher risk medical fitness standard and stricter escalation rules as in comparison with an office-based role where there's no safety critical tasks. So that by having that clear risk-based escalation framework, similar risks are going to be managed in the same way across multiple sites and different providers, unless there's a documented reason to do something different. And that's what helps to prevent outcomes depending on where the location is or which clinician happened to review the case. So if I had to summarise, my sense from a clinical governance perspective is that a defensible fitness outcome is one where you can point to clear role requirements, specifically in regard to risk, relevant contemporaneous health evidence, and a transparent documented rationale. And you can show that the employer's action were a reasonable role-anchored response to that clinical opinion. When those ingredients are all present, scrutiny becomes a review of what is effectively a coherent governance system.
Thanks, Matt. And I mean, you've spoken a lot about what can look good, but what are the most common gaps you see that make medically informed decisions indefensible, and where does that typically break down?
Yeah, I think the failure points are probably fairly consistent, and I think the first is limited role information. So where the clinician who is responsible for interpreting the health data at the pre-employment medical has been given a job title and perhaps a location, but not a meaningful description of the inherent role requirements or indeed the risk. And I think the second is variation in interpretation. You may have equally competent medical practitioners reaching different outcomes because there's no shared clinical framework guiding how health findings should be interpreted in the context of that role. And the third failure point is missing rationale. So clinicians often arrive at a sensible fitness for duty opinion, but they don't spell out how they got there. So how the clinical findings were weighed against the role risk. So when someone looks back later, there's no clear line of reasoning to stand behind. And over time, another potential failure point is governance drift. So roles can change over time, tasks can creep, but the medical assumptions may not keep up. And once you operate at scale in a very large organization across many jurisdictions, across many different sites, these gaps could multiply. And so that's why inconsistency, that we talked about before, is often the first sign that the system itself needs attention.
Yeah, for sure. It's so important to take that system-based approach, isn't it? Now, Matt, we talked a lot about the need for role-based and risk-based task information. Why can't a practitioner just get work from a job title and a general medical? We often get asked that a lot, and I'd love your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Fitness for work has never been about whether someone is healthy in general. I mean, obviously, there's an assumption that they will have sufficient health to do the job. It's about whether they are fit to safely perform the inherent role requirements. And a job title doesn't tell you whether someone is doing safety critical tasks, whether they're working alone or remotely necessarily, whether they're performing high demand cognitive or physical tasks, the extent of teamwork required, particularly for safety, or perhaps whether they're operating in environmentally extreme environments. So without that context, clinicians will guess. Some will over-restrict to be safe. Others may undercall the risk because the hazard wasn't visible to them. Neither outcome necessarily reflects poor judgment. It reflects poor inputs. And decisions based on guesswork, I think, are very difficult to defend later.
So, Matt, what does good task information actually look like in practice? And how often do employers genuinely have it?
Yeah, so good task information, in my view, is structured, it's coherent, it's role specific, and it's contemporaneous. At a minimum, particularly for higher consequence roles, my thoughts are that onboarding should clearly identify what are the safety critical tasks. Is there lone or remote work? Are there high physical demand tasks? Are there extreme environments? And I think about people who are working outdoors in tropical northern Australia, sometimes performing quite physically onerous tasks as well. And also, are there tasks where inattention or sudden incapacity could have a profound consequence for the worker, for others at the workplace, including the general public, and for the PCBU itself? This is good task information. There is a presumption that there's going to be teamwork involved and people have to be able to respond appropriately in emergency scenarios. But I think that what I previously mentioned are probably the most important aspects of good task information. Many organisations do hold elements of task and risk information, but it has at times been incomplete and hasn't kept pace with how roles and tasks have evolved over time. What matters is not the volume of documentation, but it's the integration of this information. So ensuring that this information is embedded upstream in the referral to the occupational health provider who's doing the medical. It's embedded in the assessment processes so that you're going to get consistent, defensible interpretation by clinicians who are reviewing that information.
And Matt, in practice, is that something like a job dictionary or a health risk assessment or something like that, just for everyone who's listening on the webinar? What does that look like to make sure that they're providing that to someone like you?
Exactly. So job dictionaries are very useful. But an overriding description of where the task is, what the safety critical components are. Job dictionaries often do have that detailed information, JTAs as well. I think the input quality is crucial to good output. Decision quality is what I would say. And there's lots of ways of providing that information.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So once we have that information, we're then able to create things like structured clinical frameworks. So then in your view, Matt, how do structured clinical frameworks like medical matrices help practitioners make consistent decisions without removing clinical judgment?
Yeah, first of all, just a few words on clinical frameworks, and then I'll explain the concept of the medical matrix with reference to the Carelever medical matrix that KINNECT uses. So whether we're talking about fitness for work standards or escalation thresholds, clinical frameworks exist to reduce unwarranted variation while preserving professional judgment. Well-designed clinical frameworks are evidence-informed, and they give clinicians a shared starting point for interpreting health findings and guiding decision-making. But importantly, it has to be related to the inherent role requirements. The benefit of a consistent framework is it does reduce the likelihood for unnecessary variation and makes the rationale clearer in the opinion and the decisions that are made. Obviously, the KINNECT Carelever medical matrix may be familiar to many of you today. It's a structured clinical framework built into our technology that is designed to support consistent interpretation and action when health findings are identified. And this is the important thing, in the context of specific roles and tasks in accordance with the PCBU's risk tolerance. It's developed in collaboration with employers, using an agreed understanding of role demands and risks and the employer's risk tolerance, so that when the clinical assessments are done, they're anchored to what the work is, how it's performed, and where it's performed, rather than generic job titles.
Yeah.
The matrix sits within our clinical assessment pathway, and it provides our sign-off doctors and clinicians with a shared baseline for interpreting identified health findings against known task risks. Where clinical findings fall within the expected parameters, so someone's blood pressure is within an acceptable range, or there's no history of cardiac disease, for example, outcomes can be managed fairly routinely. It's fairly straightforward. Where escalation thresholds are met or exceeded, the framework triggers a defined follow-up process, an escalation, if you like, such as a further review. So we need some information from a medical specialist to confirm that a condition is stable and well controlled, so someone can be safely deployed, or perhaps even a worksite or task restriction. So, for example, in the case of some of our remote clients, if someone has a history of anaphylaxis and they use an EpiPen, there's a restriction that they must carry their EpiPen at all times. So these are just some examples of how the matrix helps to escalate to ensure a safer outcome. And we want to be able to identify those higher risk scenarios upstream and handle them consistently. And the benefit of having a matrix is that you get much more consistent outcomes. That's the aim of it. And again, it's aligned with role risk. The other benefit, I think, of the matrix or the clinical framework is that it's more scalable across multiple work sites, multiple health providers, and so on. One other point about the matrix is that it doesn't replace clinical judgment. It channels it. So it translates role and task requirements into a shared framework so that the sign-off doctors aren't reinventing the wheel each time. It helps to answer questions like, when's this outcome usually going to be fit unconditional? When does it need escalation? When does it require restrictions? But importantly, judgment still matters. The clinical judgment still matters, particularly in nuanced cases. But the hope and the experience is that we're getting more consistent outcomes when we use a matrix.
Yeah, certainly. Matt, do you ever see a tension between standardization and the nuance that occupational medicine requires? And if you do, I mean, how do you manage that?
Well, there can be a tension, but it usually comes from misunderstanding what we're actually standardizing. And we're not standardizing clinical judgment. We're standardizing a few things. First of all, the inputs. So every clinician should be working from the same understanding of the role and its risk profile. If one clinician interprets a role as low risk and another recognizes it as safety critical, you'll see different outcomes for reasons that have nothing to do with clinical competence. So standardization of the input sets a shared baseline for interpretation. The nuance comes in, how do we actually weigh those clinical findings within the context, particularly if you've got comorbidities, multiple health issues. So that's where the nuance comes from. It's that using that clinical judgment and expertise to weigh all the pieces of information together against the role and to provide defensible medical advice that supports the employer to make a defensible decision. The nuance doesn't come from clinicians starting with different assumptions about the work itself. There's a second item that's standardized, and that's the clinical framework itself. So the medical matrix or other appropriate clinical framework and the escalation rules within that provide a standard way of sharing, of interpreting risks, so that a similar health risk in a role that is a similar SEG or with similar hazard profile is going to be interpreted consistently across the organisation. And the other thing that's standardised is the documentation expectations. That involves clear reasoning. So what did we find? What does the role require? Why did that lead to this outcome? Okay, but we don't standardise clinical judgment. Within the clinical framework, there are a number of non-negotiable fitness standards. I want to talk a little bit more about this. And these apply where the consequences of an adverse event would be catastrophic or profound. In those scenarios, the outcome should be consistent every time. There should be no discretion. So, for example, if you've got someone who comes through the medical assessment process, and let's say they're a heavy vehicle driver, and let's say that they've identified uncontrolled epilepsy, it's not an area for discretion. The consequence profile in the workplace is potentially catastrophic, and the outcome should be the same every time. There needs to be escalation. There's going to need to be further reviews. There are going to likely be restrictions and so on. There are also scenarios where the risk is going to be lower, more contextual, more modifiable. And in this case, a clinical framework allows guardrails to be applied rather than exclusions. And just by example, Zach, within the Carelever medical matrix, we have what's known as a yellow fit outcome, and that's where the sign-off doctor's clinical judgment appropriately operates when certain health issues are identified within the role. The employer is also determined that there's more tolerance for these issues. They're unlikely to impact significantly on the inherent role requirements. But it provides autonomy for us to consider health findings, but in particular when we actually combine a whole bunch of comorbidities in their full context. And we combine them and we consider them against the role demands, the task exposure, how stable the condition is, what controls are available at the workplace, and we can then determine whether restrictions or safeguards are required. So I think what remains consistent and standardized is the risk threshold. What varies transparently and intentionally is how that risk is managed. And if you've got a defensible system, these exceptions will be intentional, visible, and explainable rather than inconsistent.
So Matt, we've spoken about the medical matrices there. Where do predictive screening like PredictFit fit into this picture, and when is it appropriate versus a full medical?
So predictive tools are an early triage point. So they can surface potential issues earlier. They can reduce friction in the process, and they can help to focus clinical effort where it adds the most value, particularly at scale.
Yeah.
But predictive tools only work safely when they're anchored to accurate role risk information and sit within a clear escalation framework. Happy to discuss that further. But in higher consequence roles, where inattentional sudden incapacity could have serious impacts, human clinical oversight isn't optional. Predictive tools can assist, but they cannot replace accountable clinical decision making.
So how do you maintain meaningful human oversight then when introducing decision support tools like PredictFit or AI into a process like this?
So my view is that you maintain meaningful human oversight by design and not by good intention. So this starts with clear escalation triggers, clear clinician sign-off points, and clear documentation of clinical rationale. So these design features make it explicit where judgment sits and where it doesn't, and who remains accountable. From an APRA perspective, so the Regulatory Board for Registered Healthcare Practitioners in Australia, that clinical accountability never shifts. Decision support tools, including AI tools, predictive questionnaires, are advisory. They may help to identify risk signals or determine whether a medical assessment is indicated, but the registered healthcare practitioner remains responsible for the assessment, the interpretation, and the outcome, particularly where the consequences of error are significant. So our doctors will never sign off on a predictive fit questionnaire in isolation, only on a full medical. From an industrial relations and HR perspective, I think this distinction is also just as important. An employer may appropriately use a PredictFit type questionnaire as an initial triage tool to identify whether further medical assessment is required as part of the pre-employment process, but they need to take care that these tools are not used as a de facto employment filter.
Yeah.
Under Australian workplace law, health information can only be used to assess a worker's capacity to meet the inherent requirements of a specific role. PredictFit questionnaires should therefore be designed and used to trigger proportionate follow-up, not to exclude a worker automatically or substitute for clinical assessment. And that's why separation of roles matters. So predictive tools help to standardize when further review or consideration is warranted. Clinical frameworks guide how those findings are interpreted, and employment actions remain a human resources responsibility, anchored to the role requirements, applied consistently, and supported by explainable rationale. If we use it in this way, in my view, decision support reduces clinical risk and IR risk. It makes pathways clearer, thresholds explicit, and outcomes more defensible.
Thanks, Matt. So for employers running screening across multiple sites and multiple providers, and you would see this quite a lot, what does good governance actually look like in practice, and what are red flags that it's breaking down?
Yeah, I'll talk first about clinical governance and then a little bit about, I guess, my interpretation of employer governance. From a clinical governance point of view, good governance starts with a very clear role in the system. So clinicians provide fitness opinions and recommendations. As highlighted previously, they don't make employment or deployment decisions. Just as importantly, a good governance model indicates that a clinician has clarity about the scope of their role, what they're entitled to determine, what needs escalation and who that escalation goes to. So when those boundaries aren't clear, risk starts to drift quietly. Consistently relies heavily on the inputs that clinicians are given, as we mentioned before, and good systems also use shared interpretation frameworks to help ensure that similar risks are managed in similar ways across multiple sites and providers, and that when outcomes differ, those differences are intentional and explainable rather than accidental. I think another key part of governance here is documentation. I think it's critical. And this is being able to provide clinical reasoning to show that what was known at the time, what mattered for the role, and why the opinion was given. And this protects clinicians and also employers when decisions are later scrutinised. Strong systems also build in escalation and oversight. From the clinical side, governance can break down when doctors are working off relatively vague job titles, or if different clinicians reach very different conclusions for the same role and risk. If there's subtle pressure to just medically clear someone because an operational decision has already been made, and that does happen from time to time.
Sure.
Another big warning sign is when documentation is limited or absent, or when escalations only happen after a dispute or an incident or an audit rather than before. And this is where I think employer governance perspective matters just as much. From a client standpoint, good governance means a clear separation of responsibility. Clinicians providing fitness opinions, employers decide deployment, reasonable adjustments, risk controls. There shouldn't be any expectation that a medical assessment transfers accountability away from management. The medical informs decisions, it doesn't substitute for them. But that only works if the role itself has been accurately defined, as we mentioned before. When role risk is downgraded to make recruitment or deployment easier, the governance system can unravel. Consistency also is a marker of quality, and I think that's a governance perspective as well. So similar roles and risks should be handled similarly across sites and providers. And when decisions differ, there should be a documented role-based reason. And without that, inconsistency creeps in and becomes normalised. Medical advice also has to be used in a practical way. Now, a fitness opinion has no protective value unless it's understood and translated into action. If someone is deemed fit with restrictions, those restrictions have to exist in practice on the ground, not just on paper. And without visibility, that translation breaks down. So organisations need to be able to see how many workers are cleared, under what conditions or guardrails, where variations occur, and how issues are escalated and resolved. And that visibility is what enables prospective risk management rather than a sort of retrospective explanation. From an employer perspective, governance is usually breaking down when risk classifications begin to shift without a clear role-based rationale. When different sites treat the same medical outcome differently, when restrictions are documented but not implemented in practice, or when no one can clearly explain why a particular worker is deployed the way they were. So where prospective oversight is limited, fitness decisions just tend to be revisited only once that, once something triggers that review, whether it's an incident in the workplace or a complaint or an external audit. At that point, the organisation isn't really managing risk forward-looking. It's discovering that it's got governance gaps after the fact. So in summary, and this is a really difficult concept I found when thinking about this question, my sense is that good governance is about having a system where clinical opinions, accurate role risk information, and employer action align in a visible, consistent and defensible way. And when that alignment is missing, the red flags are always the same: inconsistency, unclear accountability, and decisions that only make sense after the fact.
Thanks, Matt. I know that you put a lot of thought into that response. So yeah, thank you for the amount of work that's gone into that. So guys, we've had a couple of questions come through the Q&A, and I know I've got a few questions for Matt as well. So I'd like you to start just popping your questions into the Q&A there now, so we can start asking Matt those in just a second. But Matt, if an employer walked away today and did one thing to improve the defensibility of their medical decisions, what would you tell them to do?
My one piece of advice would be to optimize the inputs upstream in the assessment process. So ensure that every role has a structured, current description of its inherent requirements and also its risk profile. And that this is what clinicians actually see when making their fitness opinion. Once the role requirements are clear and consistent, everything else improves. Judgment's going to be applied more consistently. Clinical frameworks become more meaningful and they're applicable to the specific scenario, to the specific risk. Predictive tools can also then be used safely and documentation becomes easier. So my sense is that by optimizing the inputs with role clarity, it enhances the defensibility of the whole process.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. So we're going to move on to the Q&A session now. So we did have a question early on that I'm going to read out, which has to do with role-based or task related information. So in your opinion, Matt, where is the balance between providing in-depth JTAs for pre-employment medicals and not giving the physician an 11-page document detailing all inherent risks?
Yeah.
So where should the focus be? And the person who's made this question said they're often getting feedback from physicians in pre-employment medicals that they just don't have time to be reviewing in-depth JTAs.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think the job description JTA is of immense value when we're looking at more complex fitness to work issues, where we're supporting rehab and return to work, rehab consultants or occupational physicians. That's where they're very, very helpful. We can get around that by providing some very key information at sort of onboarding, and that is a brief role description, the nature of the risks involved, whether the safety critical tasks, where the location is. So that sort of information can be provided without having that 11-page job dictionary. It's helpful to have them, but you're absolutely right. A doctor who's signing off on a medical is going to be able to make an efficient piece of advice or opinion by having information around role clarity, the nature of the role, the location, the level of supervision, safety critical tasks involved, high or low physical demand. And I guess if there's a functional assessment, we already have a pretty good idea of what the physical demands are going to be, because that sort of drives the functional assessment matrix. So we can actually have a shorter version. We don't need the 11-page JTA. And you're quite right, it's very hard to fit that into the schedule of reviewing the medical. When they do become helpful is when we actually escalate and identify people who may require more in-depth assessment, perhaps occupational physician overview. That's very rare, obviously, but that's when having that detailed job description and a detailed discussion with the employer is very helpful. And that's a very small proportion of cases. But for the majority of cases, having some clear role-anchored information can actually massively improve the defensibility of advice and decision-making.
Yeah, and it's often that information that we use to set up the medical matrices in Carelever as well, right? They can help present the information to the doctor in a meaningful way to hopefully mean that less 11-page documents are having to be read.
Yeah, and I'll just give an example. So if someone is working same role but different location, someone might be working in Metro Brisbane, but the same role might also be required to visit regional or rural Western Australia, where they're 400 k's away from medical support, for example. That's actually really important information that can actually help us to guide, well, what sort of assurances do we need for the medical treatment team? What sort of health risk management plan needs to be put in place to make sure they're safe when they're out remotely?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I've got another question here. So you mentioned, Matt, that an input to the structured clinical framework and therefore risk ratings is done in conjunction with an employer's risk tolerance. But that tolerance also needs to be defensible. Do medical providers and for example, KINNECT remain agnostic to this or not?
No, we're very aware of that. I mean, if there's a safety critical aspect of the role where the consequences are potentially profound, obviously the PCBU is duty bound to act, and that includes obviously having guardrails around fitness for work. So we're very aware of that. I'm very comfortable sitting down with clients talking about risk, and to me the key is what's the consequence. So even if the potential outcome of something going wrong is only possible, if the consequence is catastrophic, the outcome in terms of how we manage that risk should be consistent. So I'm very aware that risk tolerance, some people may have a higher or lower risk tolerance, but at the end of the day, they still have a non-delegable duty of care under work health and safety regulation.
Certainly. Thanks, Matt. We've got another question here. So where do you currently see the role of assessing psychological risk during pre-employment medicals, and then the ability for employers to use that information to determine the risk of employment or future decisions where impacting the ability to perform the requirements of the role? So
yeah, I mean, it's an important context, and we know that some of the sort of the industry or legislative standards do require us to ensure that individuals, if they do have a psychological issue, it's stable and well controlled before they're deployed, or they might perhaps require some guardrails. So there are legislative medicals that have some guardrails around this. I think from a general perspective, if we're inquiring about these issues, we need to make sure that they do relate to the ability to perform the job, and they should be used to support, where needed, reasonable adjustment so the employer can meet its discrimination obligations as well. But happy to have a further look. This could be another question that we sort of take offline and give some more guidance back, Zach.
Yeah, certainly, absolutely. Question here, which I think is for me and for Carelever: should we be including job dictionaries in the bookings when they're coming through Carelever? So we don't necessarily need that level for every time. What we do want to make sure is that your setup in Carelever is appropriate, so that information is there and available, for the doctors. So that's not necessarily dropping the job dictionary into every referral, but it's just making sure that the setup is correct on the back end, so that I would say the medical data is passing through the matrix filters correctly, and the doctors have the JTAs on hand in the background if they need to look at them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. The key information is that the testing that's done at functional has to relate in a coherent way to the physical demands. And we recognise that a one-off 30-minute functional assessment with lifting and carrying tests, climbing a ladder, squatting, does not necessarily translate to what happens in a work week over a working year, but there are some minimum thresholds that obviously the functional matrix sets. If someone can't do these basic things, then it's predictable that there's going to be risks in a work environment. So I think the key is to ensure that what comes into the functional matrix reflects the reasonable inherent physical requirements of the role.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Got another couple of questions here. We should have time for at least two more. We got one. Is it only the pre-employment medical and functional that you're referring to, rather than the COBORD medical subsequent reviews? Our clients have submitted specific PEM lists to gauge risk factors in order to perform the correct PEMs and assess risk. What are your thoughts there, Matt?
We might come back offline with that.
Beautiful.
Given that it's a jurisdictional specific issue, but happy to come back to the client with advice on that matter.
Yeah, and guys, for every question that is coming through to us, we are going to provide just a summary response back in writing as well. So thank you for providing them. I've just got another one here in the chat. When an occupational physician overrides the medical matrix, is there a process by which this can be flagged for the CMO for review?
Potentially.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there should be, if there's a very specific medical matrix in place that's been agreed by the client, there needs to be given that a lot of time and effort and energy goes into developing these, both from KINNECT's perspective and the client's perspective, there needs to be some guardrails. There may be instances when there's a justifiable clinical issue or a combination of issues that perhaps weren't triggered individually. But there may be, for example, an issue where there's a combination of health issues that do justify getting further medical information about someone's health to make sure that they are going to be deployed safely. I think at the very minimum, if there's been an agreement in terms of the further review process from the medical matrix itself, then I think at the very minimum there should be communication back to the client saying, hey, look, recognise that there's a matrix in place. There is a deviation from this. It is the doctor's clinical judgment that suggests that we need to deviate away from this and request this information to ensure that there's a safe deployment outcome. So I think the key is proactive communication. It doesn't necessarily have to come back to the chief medical officer unless the chief medical officer has been appointed by the organisation. So, for example, a CMO for a company to actually guardrail that and to help manage that. But I think the key is that if there's going to be deviations outside of a clinical framework, they have to be justifiable and they have to be clearly communicated back to the referrer.
Thank you, Matt. I've got another question here, which I may have to ask more generally. But do you often or ever see things like aspects like, say, the CPAP, data summaries and going for further review, which may be being asked for more than what their GP is recommending? Do you ever see that sort of friction between that, and are you able to answer that?
Yeah, there is occasionally friction. There's a couple of issues. So it can happen, and I think the key issue is if it's required, it's not required because we're just interested in clinical data. It's required to ensure that any opinion we provide regarding fitness is defensible and it's based on accurate contemporaneous health information. So sometimes the medical matrix will trigger that. Quite a lot of our matrices, particularly for the high-risk roles, if someone has actually disclosed sleep apnea, that will trigger a further review requirement. And that will either involve a 3-month summary of CPAP data, but in some cases it may actually require a sleep physician report. Now, it doesn't have to be a report from this week. It could be a report from 3 months ago, for example. So there is occasionally some friction, but the key is we're not collecting the data for fun. We need the information to be able to provide a defensible opinion regarding fitness, particularly in high stake situations where the consequence of an adverse event, in this case, for example, if someone's not complying with their CPAP or it's not working well enough, they have a moment of inattention or a micro sleep, and you could see that the consequence profile could be catastrophic.
Sure.
So it's the need to request that information is reflected upon the nature of the medical and then the consequence of failing to collect that information.
Thank you, Matt. So that's all the questions that have come through to us. That was a good number. Thank you, everyone. Like we said, we'll have a response through to everybody in writing. Now, just to finish off, we do have our contact details here. If you'd like to see, Carelever, functioning, or how the medical matrices actually work in practice, you're welcome to reach out and we can take you through that. And if you'd like to discuss pre-employment medicals, health surveillance, you're welcome to get in contact with the KINNECT team directly. But we will be in touch with a copy of the recording and an answer to all your questions in writing. Thank you all so much for attending today, and thank you, Dr. Matt Brandt, for the amount of effort that you went to in putting your responses together.